Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents I Hope We Choose Love, a trans girl's notes from the end of the world, by Cheng Thom. Narrated by Nicky Endres. Introduction. With love, from the end of the world. As I write this book in the spring of 2019, it has become something of a truism among my community of queer people of color that the end of the world is nigh. A wave of right-wing and openly fascist governments have been elected to power across the world. Wealth and power are increasingly concentrated in the hands of a brazenly corrupt few. Climate change and mass extinction are ravaging the earth, largely unacknowledged by those with the political power to do anything about it. As for those communities of queer people, racialized people, disabled people, marginalized people that have been taking back their power, the social justice activists that raised me to believe in the possibility of a revolution that would change and save the world, sometimes it seems like the most painful cuts of all come from within my own community. Call-out culture, lateral violence, puritanical politics, intimate partner abuse, public shaming. We know so much about trauma, but so little about how to heal it. What would community know about saving us from the apocalypse? In 2016, I turned 25 years old and published my first novel, which was quickly followed by a poetry collection and then a children's book, all to relative success. I became queer famous that year. This was also the year that broke my heart, which has kept right on breaking ever since. This was the year that Trump was elected, that millions of people were displaced in the Syrian refugee crisis, and that 49 people, most of them queer and brown, were shot to death in a nightclub in Orlando, Florida. In the intervening years, more disasters and atrocities have followed. My 25th year of life was also the year that I experienced several devastating personal crises that resulted in the loss of some dear friends and chosen family members, as well as psychological trauma from which I have not recovered. For all its edgy pretensions, social justice culture had not prepared me for the havoc that abuse, mental illness, and the immense pressure of living as a publicly known trans woman of color in the social media era could wreak upon my soul. Not only was I in pain, but my pain was publicly known, scrutinized, gossiped over. People, mostly queer and racialized people, whom I didn't know, sent me emails and Facebook messages that were thousands of words long, asking for intimacy and attention and occasionally threatening me when I didn't acquiesce. Journalists asked me for interviews about my private life, my sex life, my family, my mental health. No topic seemed to be off limits. I was stalked, in real life and online. I became terrified and paranoid. I stopped trusting people and this thing we call community. I stopped trusting myself. All around me, the people I loved were also in crisis. Psychological, financial, medical, interpersonal. When you live in a community of queers, anarchists, and activists, crisis is the baseline, and stability an outlier. Among trans women, a life expectancy of 35 is the norm. I lost my faith in community. I lost hope in social justice, in revolution, in the world. When we lose faith in the things that matter, it is easy to turn to anger. Anger helps us survive when survival seems impossible. I've been very angry throughout my life, and I still am in some ways. I need to be, to live. Yet anger and its siblings, rage and vengeance, have also been poisonous influences in my communities. I've seen people do awful things to one another in the name of anger and revenge, and it never seems to help anyone in the end. So, in the midst of despair, I have come to believe that love, the feeling of love, the politics of love, the ethics and ideology and embodiment of love, is the only good option in this time of the apocalypse. What else do we have? I mean love that is kind, but also honest. Love that is courageous and relentless and willing to break the rules and smash the system. Love that cares about people more than ideas, that prizes each and every one of us as essential and indispensable. I mean love that is compassionate and accountable. I mean love that confirms and reaffirms us as complex and fallible, yet lovable anyway. Love that affirms us as human. I want to live in love and believe in love. If I have to die, I want to die in love. This whole world might be coming to its end, or it might be in the midst of an enormous and terrifying change that leads to something better. Either way, I want to go through it in love, with the people I love. So this is a book about love, which is a sentence I never thought I would write. This is a book that I never thought I could write. It isn't easy to believe in love. Not after so many people and ideals I held so dear have hurt me or been taken from me. But then I too have hurt people and taken things from people. I have made mistakes, and I have done worse than mistakes. I still want to be believed in and loved. So this is a book about love. This is a book about revolutionary love. Love that might not save us at the end of the world, but that might make it possible to live through. It may be hard to believe in. It will be harder to live. I hope we choose it anyway. In Love That Never Dies. Cheng Thom, April 2019. Part 1. Let Us Live. Righteous Callings, Being Good, Leftist Orthodoxy, and the Social Justice Crisis of Faith. Deep down, I have always believed that I'm a bad person, and that the world we live in is an awful place. Maybe that's just what happens when you grow up an effeminate boy, secretly a trans girl, in a Chinese, Canadian, Christianish, not religious enough to go to church, but enough to use the threat of eternal damnation as a motivator for household chores. Family with class trauma and inherited mental health issues, you know? One of my first memories is of crawling on the kitchen table in our rat-infested house at 4 years old and thinking to myself, I'm spoiled. Mommy and Daddy have such hard lives. I wish I weren't so bad. I better work harder. #migrant kid mentality. Fast forward to me in a hospital bed in the psych ward after my suicide attempt at 16 years old, still thinking the same thing. Double fast forward to me at 26 in 2017, first typing this essay through chronic pain and brain fog in bed on a Saturday morning, still thinking the same thing. So in retrospect, it's easy to see how I got into the whole social justice / radical queer activism thing. Like most of my peers, all I wanted was to be good. or in the fashionable parlance of various political moments in the past 10 years, rad, down, or woke. Like, my mentally ill transsexual ass was never gonna hack my parents' idea of goodness, unlike my Harvard-educated, biodegradable plasticizer-inventing, engaged to a hedge fund manager, psychiatry-resident older sister. But the rad queer community offered me a whole new set of norms for performance and lovability that, at least on the surface, gave value to the identity factors: transsexuality, effeminacy, mental illness, general bad attitude, that had caused me so much childhood shame. Oh yeah, and I was a crazy trans girl of color living in a white, cis-dominant society. Where else could I go? What else could I do? It was a whole new chance to be good, to be righteous, to do good works and become lovable at last. These days, a friend of mine, we're similarly jaded, likes to jokingly, / not so jokingly, call me a high priestess of the movement. Putting it another way, my boyfriend calls me a micro-celebrity. What this means is that I have published 2 books that are well regarded in the social justice art / activism scene. I'm occasionally stopped on the street by strangers, and I get a lot of likes on Facebook. Also, I get some money for speaking engagements, articles, not this one when it was first published, though, and book royalties. It works out to a tiny fraction of minimum wage if you break down the money received per hour worked. In other words, I made it. I'm good / rad / woke TM. At least for the moment. All it would take to change that is a few hasty problematic tweets. And all I had to do was incur a mild disability via burnout and post-traumatic stress disorder to get here. Hooray. Beneath all this cynicism, I hold a genuine curiosity. How did we, the loosely defined social justice left of North America / Turtle Island, one of the original indigenous names for this continent, reach this sorry state? I say we and not I, because I think that my personal narrative is illustrative of a general dynamic that a lot of folks in my cohort of social justice warriors, for those new to the discourse, SJWs is the preferred acronym, are experiencing in some form. There seems to be a wave, if not a sea change, moving through online and real-life leftist communities / scenes, a ripple of dis-ease, if you will, with the ways affect, the experience and performance of emotion, and orthodoxy, the creation of norms of political thought and action, are currently playing out. More and more, we are starting to question the ways we relate to politics and to each other. You can see this ripple being articulated in several pieces of contemporary social justice writing, each of which has been met with some notoriety and controversy. I'm not attesting to the quality or importance, or lack thereof, of these texts. I agree with some of them, disagree with others, and generally feel complicated about all of them. The common thread is their critique of the social justice left from within the social justice left. Sarah Schulman's book, Conflict is Not Abuse, in which Schulman analyzes and critiques what she calls the overstatement of harm as an activist tactic that breaks community bonds and reinforces the power of the state to control and imprison people. Porpentine Charity Heartscape's essay, Hot Allostatic Load, which is an account of how the author was bullied, exploited, and traumatized by queer scenes that weaponized social media call-outs against her. Trent Edie's article, Everything is Problematic, in which the author draws parallels between student activism during the 2012 Quebec student strike and dogmatic cult thinking. Francis Lee's article, Excommunicate Me from the Church of Social Justice, which is a comparison of virtue signaling and shaming dynamics between right-wing Christianity and the social justice left, and an appeal for greater open-mindedness on the left. Angela Nagel's book, Kill All Normies, in which the author argues that the current rise of the alt-right and neo-nationalism in American, and, to some extent, global politics, was largely inspired by the political polarization of the renewed culture wars between increasingly disenfranchised right-wing Americans and the alienating politics of the American progressive left. More popularly, the YouTube vlogger Lacey Green, a self-identified feminist sex educator who accrued mainstream acclaim and several hundreds of thousands of followers, initiated a subcultural scandal by taking the red pill and recanting many of her former progressive political ideas, among them the argument that the male-female sex binary is socially constructed and oppressive to trans people. Green also started hosting dialogues with vloggers across the political spectrum, starting with radical feminists who exclude trans women and sex workers from their movement and anti-SJWs, otherwise known as the alt-right. On Twitter, Green has decried the extremely negative reactions of many of her former fans as regressive, thought-policing, and discursively violent. I know, right? Blah. What's up with the social justice crisis of faith? Why is it happening? And what's an overachieving yet politically disenchanted, attachment-traumatized East Asian tranny who wants to survive and also be a decent person in the world supposed to do? Well, she could write her own essay trying to make sense of it all, for one. I'm expecting the majority of listeners of this essay to be from the social justice movement. Why else would you be interested? Are you an anti-SJW/alt-writer trying to use this as fodder for your masturbatory Reddit thread? Ew. Please go away. So it will probably come as no surprise to you when I write that, in my experience, there are many leftist and marginalized folks who are not always comfortable with the direction of the social justice left and, in particular, its focus on increasingly fragmented identity politics and the performance of virtue. In fact, most of what I do now when I'm hanging out with friends in the community is complain about the dynamics of the community. Let me pause here to assure you, dear listeners, that this essay is not going in an, and now I am a classic liberal, both sides are wrong, I'm not like those other progressives, direction. Fuck that noise. I hold the following truths to be self-evident. We live in a world fundamentally shaped by the systemic exploitation and abuse of many oppressed peoples. Capitalism and ableism are dominant systems of oppression that reduce the worth of individuals to their ability to work and produce goods for the privileged classes. Everyone deserves access to life resources, dignity, and self-determination, regardless of ability. For the past several centuries, European capitalism and imperialism have resulted in the ongoing colonization and, in many cases, genocide of indigenous peoples across the globe, as well as the enslavement and indentured servitude of people of color. Black and indigenous peoples particularly have been and continue to be disproportionately targeted for racist exploitation, violence, discrimination, and imprisonment to this day. The repression of women and gender nonconforming individuals, as well as so-called sexual minorities, plays a fundamental role in upholding the structures of oppression at large. People who live at the intersections of oppression, such as trans women of color sex workers, have unique and intensified experiences of marginality. Trans women are women. The work of contemporary movements such as Black Lives Matter and Idle No More is vital and necessary and must be supported. Sex work, when chosen freely by the worker, is legitimate work that provides valuable services to the public and should be decriminalized and respected. Sex work differs from human trafficking, which involves the exploitation of individuals' bodies, often for sexual purposes, but also for other forms of domestic and manual labor. Oppression is rarely, if ever, overthrown through peaceful demonstration alone. Economic and social pressure, as well as direct action and violent protest, are all essential parts of revolutionary movements. So maybe let's just proceed from there, okay? The mainstream critiques of social justice culture are many, vicious and largely rooted in either liberal appeals to the status quo. SJWs are undermining their own cause by being so angry and idealistic. Incremental change, FTW. Or outright misogyny, racism, and neo-fascism. I'm not going to bother deconstructing these arguments, mostly because this has already been done rather spectacularly by other thinkers and writers. I'm much more interested in the more complicated gray area within the left itself, which is where yours truly spends most of her time these days. The following list is a summation of struggles I have with social justice culture, while acknowledging that the community and the movement are not in the least monolithic, or even necessarily a politically united body. I am taking in generalities taken mostly from my experiences of activism and rad queer community in major cities on Turtle Island, as well as from that venerable birthplace of revolutionary thought, the Internet. I know that these thoughts are, for the most part, not original, and undoubtedly I am oversimplifying certain issues or presenting an unbalanced view of them. My goal here is not to claim the credit for a sparkling new piece of analysis, but rather to capture the spirit of my own thoughts and feelings as they have been informed by readings, experiences, and conversations with friends. And so, some struggles I, and maybe others, have with the social justice movement's internal culture: fragmentation of identity politics and essentialism. In case referring to myself as a crazy East Asian transsexual doesn't get this across, I am an original identity politics girl. TM. Social justice ideas about identity, particularly race and gender, empowered and liberated me as a teenager, and continue to do so today. The language of identity politics allows us to describe social power dynamics that would otherwise remain invisible, such as white privilege, shadeism, and transmisogyny. However, as resources dwindle and income inequality widens under late-stage capitalism, I think we are seeing increasing fragmentation and oversimplification of identity politics via the oppression Olympics, harsh competition for resources like funding, attention, and legitimacy based on the number and type of oppressed identities one can claim. This often happens on an individual level. Simply put, in social justice land, we emphasize our marginalized identities and downplay our privileged ones to seem cooler and more important, and to shield ourselves from critique. Online, I sometimes see arguments in which people try to shut each other down using identities as weapons. For example, "You can't talk to me that way. I'm trans and you're being transphobic." "Oh yeah? Well, I'm a femme and you're a mask. Shut your misogynist femphobic mouth." This type of identity politics is based on a level of essentialism that I am uncomfortable with. It assumes that all people of color, trans folks, etc., have the same experience, and that identity categories apply uniformly across the board. It also reduces people to a very restricted set of relevant identities and erases the rest of their life experiences while fetishizing the pain of the oppressed. Strategic essentialism, the ability to talk and form groups based on generalities, is an important tool for activism, but the kind of identity politics that discomforts me is not strategic so much as disingenuous and self-serving. It often feels like we are far more interested in diversity of identity rather than diversity of thought. Reliance on binaries. With essentialism comes the reductive categorizing of people and systems into false binaries: oppressor, oppressed, survivor, abuser, problematic, pure. Again, these terms are useful in particular moments, but they can also obscure the nuances and fluidity of any one person or situation, as in how a white working-class person may, in some cases, experience more material struggle than, say, an Asian middle-class person, and vice versa. Safety and regressivism. The concept of safety has come to dominate a particular strain of social justice practices, perhaps most famously the use of trigger or content warnings before discussing or showing potentially distressing material. However, the politics of safety grow more broadly from the movement's emphasis on personal consent to touching, social interaction, and exposure to ideas. I am a trauma survivor, quelle surprise, and the thought of safety consumes me on a day-to-day basis. I am sympathetic to the need for safety because, most of the time, I don't feel safe. But I struggle with safety politics when the safety of an individual or group comes at the expense of another individual or group's freedom. Alt-writers like to whine about the loss of freedom of speech to the politics of safety, by which they mean white dudes' freedom to be virulently misogynist, racist, transphobic, ableist. I am more concerned about vulnerable individuals who stand to actually lose social access and bodily autonomy. I am thinking, for example, about queer community centers where I have worked that restrict the access of mentally ill trans women and homeless people because their very presence makes middle-class queers feel unsafe. Safety is, I believe, an inherently classed, raced, and gendered experience that frequently runs the risk of being used for regressive ends. Ironically, for restricting the freedoms of the vulnerable, those who are never really safe. Often we see the call for safety actually reinforce the power of oppressive institutions, like the police and the prison system in our lives. When we choose safety over liberation, our movements fail. Performance of virtue. The social justice internet is rife with peer pressure to repeatedly and consistently demonstrate one's adherence to the norms of thought and belief that are currently in fashion. We strive to outdo each other's comments, tweets, and status updates with political critiques and takedowns while using the latest, most perfect, unoppressive terminology. I have heard friends describe this as activist theater, where goodness is performed and absolution for the original sins of privilege and ignorance is temporarily granted. Perceived problematicness is frequently ferociously dragged, and meaningful dialogue is rare, though it does occur. The cultural atmosphere is thus more conducive to anxiety-driven attempts to prove one's goodness through faith in the dogma.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?